This is where Juan, Linz, and Alfred Stepan come in, right? This is where the 5 arenas of consolidated democracy really help us out. Over the years, students have found that this particular reading is probably the easiest and the most straightforward. And again, to their credit, Linz and Stepan are fairly good writers, and I remember even as an early grad student, I was reading this. I'm giving this to you guys as undergrads, so you're definitely a couple of years ahead of my then contemporaries. But the 5 arenas of consolidated democracy, as articulated by them: civil society, political society, the rule of law, state bureaucracy, and finally an institutionalized economic society. All of them are necessary for reaching that qualitatively consolidated democratic framework. And all of them work together in tandem, right? Now, some countries may not have all 5, but the idea is that if you have all 5 working and you're working harmoniously with the other 4, chances are you're going to be a rather successful consolidated democracy. All right, so let's explore each of these 5 components, and let's try to figure out what are the importance of each one and how they're interrelated. And it's not a surprise that we begin with civil society, right? Civil society was all the rage in democratic transition literature in the early to mid-1990s because it was widely understood that the transitions to democracy in Eastern Europe, right, specifically the countries of Poland and Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, right, those, were all predicated on the concept of people power. Right? There were visual representations of mass protests in the streets against these entrenched authoritarian bureaucratic governments. And while civil society is or was nothing really new at the time, it was something that was widely praised for being one of the major catalysts for bringing democratic transition to these states and societies. So civil society is widely understood to be the arena of the state where self-organizing groups, movements, and individuals function independently of the state and articulate values and forge group solidarities. So it's effectively the role of the public, right? And not just a mobilized public, but the idea of an empowered public. And to go even beyond that, I would say the notion of citizenry is very, very important. Because while we oftentimes conflate the two terms, citizen and public, together, the understanding of citizenship or citizenry means that there are certain rights and privileges that people living in a community possess and know they possess, and understand that these rights, these empowered rights, give them the ability to hold their elected officials accountable, audit and criticize, political practice, and if necessary, right, organize, either through formal institutions or, if absolutely necessary, in the street, to voice collective grievances against, mismanaged, political rule. So the understanding that the public was somehow a primary catalyst in forcing these beleaguered bureaucratic authoritarian governments in Eastern and Central Europe to, at the absolute least, bargain their way out of power, or at the absolute worst, be expelled from power, is something that is, I think, very important for the establishment of a democratic system. Because if the public is somehow mobilized and empowered, then it means that government cannot just simply operate unencumbered and unaccountable. This makes civil society critical for government transparency and evaluation, and, checks the authority of the state. So, this stuff had been written, in American political science literature, going all the way back to the 50s and the 60s, right? The town councils, a number of social organizations, and of course we can include within this, right, things like trade unions and, PTAs and Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and bowling leagues and, Rotary clubs and, all forms of, let's say, citizen association And yes, civil society can certainly have a sort of a socio-political agenda. They can certainly voice collective viewpoints. But the point here is that within a democratic framework, these institutionalized viewpoints are meant to strengthen and augment the concept of public democracy. So it's not a surprise that we begin these 5 stages by noting the importance of public empowerment. Okay? Now, civil society by itself, gets you certainly in the door in terms of seeing whether or not a society is democratic or democratizing. But there's one other, I think, counter variable that goes along with that, and that's political society. Right? Political society is really, I don't want to say the antithesis of civil society, but it's the recipient, right? It's the counterbalance to what civil society is. Now, political society is the arena of the state that is organized around exercising public, what we here mean elected power, of the state apparatus. Political society is responsible for directing state government and state power. And so it's sort of assumed, right, that in a democracy, civil society and political society are congruent, right? They're compatible. Civil society holds political society accountable, but it is the responsibility of political society to carry out the interests of civil society, right? We elect you to do X, Y, and Z, and therefore we expect you to enact X, Y, and Z. And if you do so, great. Next time you're up for re-election, you got our votes. You don't do that, we want to know why you didn't. And if there's a plausible excuse, maybe we'll give you another shot. Or if you just decide that you're not interested in it, well, then we'll replace you with someone else. The understanding about political society here is that it must be receptive and it must be openly accessible to the public. So a political society cannot close itself off behind locked doors, backfilled, smoke-filled rooms. Political society cannot be oligarchic. It cannot be unaccountably elitist. But political society, at least in the theoretical sense, right, needs to somehow be constantly working with civil society. Okay? Now, you've got those two, right? So far, so good. And, look, in most situations, you'll find within a working, functioning, quality democracy, these two working quite hand in hand. But that's basically about a third of what we need. And now kind of comes more of the structural elements that make democracy work. And I think that no one here is going to find any problem with the rule of law. I mean, the rule of law is, kind of your primary foundation. In fact, I'd even go so far as to say that if you don't have a democratic rule of law, you can civil and political society all that you want, but without that democratic, solid foundation of laws and norms and procedures, nothing is ever going to get accomplished. Linz and Stepan, sort of understand the rule of law in this case to be sort of institutional routinization. In other words, the democratic rule of law is going to be there regardless of who is in office, regardless of who is elected, right? And, a couple of slides back, I had mentioned that, a consolidated democracy is one in which it doesn't matter who we elect to office. We can elect, it doesn't matter which party we elect to office. Democrats, Republicans, Labor, Conservatives, Christian Dems, Social Dems, whatever it is, right? The rule of law is going to be unassailable, it is going to be untouchable, and it is going to be sacrosanct. So, for instance, in the United States, right, constitutional law is considered to be the supreme authority of the land. And that constitutional law provides the structural environment for civil and political society to operate, right? It's literally the code that that defines and describes and shapes the state and the government. And the rule of law is understood to be universal, functioning through rational legal authority. Now, this is a little shout out to Max Weber, late 19th century German philosopher, political theorist, not the easiest guy to read. But, Weber had understood authority to be classified in 3 broad categories: rational legal, traditional, and charismatic. Rational legal is the most objective and the most democratic because it doesn't matter who's in power. It doesn't matter whether your leader is a demagogue or just a simple bureaucratic paper pusher. What is on the books is on the books, and people follow those laws to the letter. Traditional authority tends to be much more normative and subjective and favors, one set of ideologies over another. And charismatic leadership can be potentially dangerous because we're following an individual rather than adhering to the basic foundations of the law. So for instance, when we talk about rational legal authority, we may not necessarily agree with what is legally on the books. Right? We may not necessarily agree with the state-mandated speed limits on highways. We may not agree with, the minimum drinking age to be 21 and the driving age to be 18. But there's nothing we can really do about it. And the thing about it is that a rational legal law means that that law is applied to everyone, regardless of station, creed, class, color, sex, age, or handicap. So if you are caught speeding, right, you're pulled over by the cop, and the cop says, hey, you were doing 80 in a 65. And you could make the argument by saying, well, we really should be doing 80. And the cop's like, hey, we all should be doing 90, but the sign says 65. Here's a ticket. Now, the cop is going to give you a ticket for speeding. But if the cop pulls over the son of the police chief the next time around and also gives him a ticket, not going to happen, but you know what I'm now we're talking about rational legal, right? Both of you go to traffic court. You're, in front of the judge. And ideally, what we would like is that the judge is going to hand out a sentence that is similar between you and the son of the police chief, right? Both of you were speeding, and that's it. We also understand that, these laws are paramount and they're hegemonic. In the same way that, let's say, when I say universal, right, it's not that these laws will change by different geography. So another example that I like to give is no matter where you go in the United States and basically anywhere in the world, right, traffic lights have the same color codes, right? Red means stop, green means go. The only place for ambiguity is yellow, where some people decide go really fast, and then you get those really annoying people that when the minute the light changes yellow, they slam on the brakes, okay? And if you're one of those people, please do that behind me, The thing is that you run a red light, cop's going to pull you over. Right? You could argue that the light was yellow and you couldn't stop, but whatever. But we all know red means stop, green means go, right? If you go to another location and suddenly the traffic lights are, purple, blue, and magenta. I don't know, purple, blue, and orange or whatever. You don't really know what's going on here. So the idea of a rule of law is that it needs to be not only universal, but it needs to be objective. It needs to be applicable to everyone, regardless of socioeconomic status. Part of that also implies the existence of an independent judicial system. Now, this is something that, if you've taken, American government classes, you think, well, of course, independent judicial system. We tend to forget that there are a number of countries around the world where the judicial system tends to still be under the control of one of the other branches of government, or more often than not, comprises judges that are deliberately handpicked and placed in various court circuits because of their loyalty to the regime. We're beginning to see that now, and we have seen that over the past couple of years, as McConnell has simply just, run through a number of reactionary and conservative judges here. That tends to, get lost in our fixation on Trump's erratic behavior. But the point to be made here is that a rule of law needs to have an objective, independent judiciary to provide the necessary checks and balances on the legislative and if they exist, the executive. This doesn't seem like this is anything new, right? This is pretty self-evident. If we're going to be talking about what defines a democracy, a democratic rule of law is certainly something that absolutely has to be there. All right, number 4. And this is kind of one of my favorites. You would think state bureaucracy. Rossi, come on. There's nothing interesting about a state bureaucracy. Hang on a second. This is state bureaucracy is one of those weird elements that I like to say is the one non-democratic component that is necessary to make a larger democratic system work. Okay? Let me repeat that. A state bureaucracy is that one potentially non-democratic component, ingredient, element, that is necessary to make the larger democratic system work. A state bureaucracy, defined by Linz and Stepan, is one that has the capacity to command, regulate, and extract. So, in other words, a state bureaucracy is all the processes, all of the day-to-day paper-pushing administrative operations that take place behind the scenes, right? Behind the scenes. These are the little gears that work. These are the little pistons that make the car go. Or as I like to allude, and this is more so for those of you who have PCs than Macs, although I'm sure it's pretty much the same thing. If you do what I like to call the 3-key punch, Control-Alt-Del, and there's a little window that pops up, and you have the opportunity of clicking on this tab called Task Manager. And you click on the Task Manager, and you see that there's all these little programs that are working behind the scenes to keep the computer working, to keep your program operating, and to prevent your computer from shutting down or giving you the blue screen of death. You don't know what half these programs are. You don't even know where they're located on your hard drive. And sometimes they work because 2 or 3 other programs, systems are working at the same time. But you know that, and this is especially true for PC people, you know that if one of these little back-end programs stops working, the rest of your computer runs the risk of acting screwy. Every so often, you'll get these little pop-up windows. This program has performed an illegal function and needs to shut down. I don't know what an illegal function is. It's my own damn computer. I didn't do anything illegal on it. But I know that if that happens, I run the risk of losing whatever data that I have. That, ladies and gentlemen, is state bureaucracy. State bureaucracy are the processes, the offices, the institutions, and the people that work behind the scenes to make the front-end stuff work arguably seamlessly, okay? So a state bureaucracy is responsible for, allocating resources and distributing them, right? So they handle the taxation, they handle the public spending, they handle the licenses, they handle, all sorts of minute day-to-day administrative responsibilities that we know needs to be there in order for the rest of the country to operate. They're the things that make government accountable as well as transparent. But here's the thing, because I mentioned that the state bureaucracy is potentially the one non-democratic element, because more often than not, people who work within the state bureaucracy, whatever departments they happen to be, they don't run for their office. They're not held accountable by the public. It is, for the most part, a career job that one has. And, I can't imagine that, anyone, 18 years old or whatever, dreams of growing up to become, someone who works in the DMV, or the Bureau of Taxation, right? It's just sort of like these, I don't know how you get these jobs, but you also know, at least traditionally speaking, these jobs are secure. They come with state health care, which is very, very good. And they come with a certain sense of anonymity, right? So you're a number cruncher. You're working in some office with a whole bunch of other people, and you're just doing paperwork. You're doing boring, mind-numbing paperwork, but you are doing something to keep the country, the state, the town, the county, whatever it is, functioning. We don't know who you are, and you yield a good degree of power, right? And, beyond just simply the office workers, right, we can have people who direct certain public works authorities or who are in charge of, certain bureaus or whatever it is, right? They wield a certain degree of command, power, and decision-making, but they are not beholden to the public. They're the ones that decide how a road is going to go, how a school is going to be built, how a zoo is going to be renovated, how a park is going to be cleaned. And once that happens, the mayor, the governor is the one that shows up with the ceremony, the novelty scissors, opens the thing open, and everybody gives praise to the mayor or the governor or the president. But they didn't do anything. Right? The bureaucracy is the one that handled all the day-to-day mechanisms. And so the thing is that, and this is why I find it to be so interesting, is because when we think about democracies, folks, we think that it's just democratic from top to bottom. We think that everybody just kind of lives, breathes, eats, and sleeps, democratic ideals. But one of the big components about a democracy working are the interior gears and cogs, right, that are necessary for the larger thing to work. And by and large, if you have ever dealt with state bureaucracy, if you've ever dealt with trying to get your passport renewed or your driver's license, or you spend time, in the post office or whatever it is, you realize that, this is not a democratic system. You're kind of beholden to what the Patties and Selmas behind the counter want you to do. But you know what? The Patties and Selmas are necessary to keep the larger thing operating. And their job is, as I said, to uphold government accountability as well as transparency. So, a little side detour to note that there's a whole bunch of ones and zeros. There's a whole bunch of code that, keeps the rest of the thing working seamlessly. And then finally, we have economic society, which, not surprisingly, Linz and Stepan are writing in the early 90s, although they have been working as a collaborative team throughout the 80s and even the late 70s. So, their work on, democratic transition theory is certainly out there and well respected. But they adhere to the idea that a democracy also needs some kind of market economy to function. Now, there's nothing, shocking about this, right? But when we talk about a market economy, we are not referring to the type of deregulated, economic Darwinistic economy that we're now all victims of. But they are very specific about a regulated market economy. So, at the absolute most, we're referring to, let's say, a Keynesian system, where the state will allow the market to operate within an acceptable playing field, but the state does have the responsibility, the moral responsibility, to intervene if the economy seems to be either lagging or there's one or two industries that seem to be taking off and running the risk of monopolizing the entire enterprise. So, when we talk about a market economy here, I would also suggest that the idea is a market economy with a significant amount of social welfare, right? So, taxation, public taxation from the economies go towards, basic services like education, transportation, healthcare, unemployment insurance, things like that. So it's not necessarily just, rampant capitalism is going to make a democracy. Actually, Linz and Stepan would be one of the first to say, capitalism in the absence of a regulated market economy is going to give us, at the absolute best, some kind of competitive oligarchy with very little public participation. So you want that contestation and participation. Nothing is going to guarantee participation more than the idea that the public's money, the public taxation money, is going to go towards invested goods and services. So an economic society is one in which, revenue is invested within the community. Now, all five of these criteria, right, are interlinked and are interdependent within this systemic model of democracy. And I think one of the things that students over the years like about the Linz and Stepan reading is that it's not only straightforward, but they have this great little chart at the end of their chapter to explain how one is related to the other. So, at the end of the day, right, you think to yourself, all right, all of these things are in working form. All of them are at least, one of these things are working in tandem with at least two of the others. Well, you've got yourself, some kind of functioning, consolidated democratic system. So, when is democracy consolidated? Democracy becomes a consolidated phenomenon, right, when behaviorally, attitudinally, and constitutionally, any alternative political structure other than democracy is small enough, insignificant enough to pose no threat to the democratic system. Okay? So look, there's no country out there today that doesn't have an extremist group operating. But if the extremist group, and it doesn't matter whether it's, hard left or worse, hard right, right? If the extremist group is just a bunch of small scattered crazies that, can't really, get beyond organizing past, meeting in a Denny's every 2 weeks or whatever to talk about the overthrow of the government, while the rest of the people in the dining room laugh at them hysterically, then you know that you're doing good. You know that you're doing good. I mean, even before Trump became the phenomenon that he was, I remember teaching this class in the early to mid 2000s, and I said, look, you know that this country's got crazies, but you go to sleep at night knowing that the crazies are nowhere nearer seizing power than they were the night before. So you know that they're there, but the likelihood of them coming to power, if not locally, definitely nationally, is so statistically insignificant that it's not even worth, trying to stamp them out. Just let them do their own thing. As long as the crazies are, are a little more than, the angry crazy guy that shouts at traffic in front of the local post office. I mean, you can kind of make that into a novelty. So, in other words, when democracy is quote unquote the only game in town, you know that democracy has been consolidated. When you are absolutely fed up with your elected officials and you choose new officials, but within the confines of constitutional law and democracy, well, then democracy is not the thing that's endangered, right? And I remember, now we're going on well over 12 years or so, when I was living in Belgrade back in 2008. I was doing research for my dissertation at the time, and I was speaking with the head of this one think tank, this one NGO, the Center for Cultural Decontamination. Interesting group. And, the head of the group, her name was Borka Pajicevic. It's 2008. So, let's see, this is, when is this? This is the spring. So this is January through June of '08. So George W. Bush was still president. And one of the things that came up in the conversation was, I was trying to talk about fledgling democracy, or in Serbia, right? The country had transitioned back to democracy in early 2000, and was on their way, but there were still some problems and obstacles. And she turns to me and she says, "You know what is fantastic about the United States?" She says, "You could not only elect a certified idiot in 2000, but you could re-elect him in 2004. And your country is not falling apart. The mail is still being delivered. Schools are still being run. Bureaucracy is still functioning, right? The cows still give milk, the sun still rises, the roads are still paved, life goes on in the United States. You could elect a crazy to power and the mechanisms of government still function." Or as she says, in her country, every time a new government comes to power, there runs the risk that the Constitution is going to be amended, rewritten, laws change, favors are granted, nepotism runs rampant, right? In the United States, she said at the time, you're basically operating with a hand tied behind your back with George W. Bush, and the country is still operating. And I think that, I go back to what she was saying and thinking about 4 years with Trump, and the media would want you to believe that this country is in shambles, that the country is falling apart. I'm thinking, not really. Not really. I mean, despite the, protests and whatever that happened, in early January, I'm recording this lecture now on the 15th of January. There will be, I hope so, a seamless transition to power. Trump will be swept away. Biden is going to come in, and it's business as usual. Right? So democracy is consolidated when, democracy is the only game in town. I mean, it sounds pretty normative, but, it kind of gets the point across. Now, when I was teaching this class, again, back in the, mid-2000s, and I just finished by saying democracy is the only game in town. I remember this as if it were last week. Student raises his hand and says, and this is probably one of the most poignant questions that a student has ever asked me. He says, does that mean that democracy is hegemonic? And I pause for a moment because the word hegemony oftentimes is associated with more authoritarian, more dictatorial mindsets. And, I was kind of thinking for about, 5-10 seconds here because this is, wow, great question. And I finally answered by saying, yes, democracy is consolidated when the idea of democracy is hegemonic, when the public simply cannot fathom any other alternative ideology running their country. And to kind of relativize this, it doesn't mean that democracy is dictatorial. But, when we think of hegemony, and here I'm referring to the writings of Antonio Gramsci. He's a late 19th, early 20th century Italian anarchist. Hegemony is generally understood to be this kind of top-down process, right? Where there's a group of people that run a state, a society, whatever it is, at the top. And they impose a certain set of laws, norms, ideologies that are unassailable and, uncontested. And the thing is that if we stop just there, we run the risk of thinking that the public is oppressed, right? There's nothing that they can do about it, but they're just simply oppressed. That's actually oppression. That's not hegemony. Hegemony requires one additional step, okay? And according to Gramsci, right, hegemony is not only an effort by elites to elicit consent from the public, but also an effort to generate a set of foundational myths that define and institutionalize a particular imagery of state and society. In other words, hegemony is not just a top-down form of control, but it is a type of, if you want to look at it this way, right, ideological structure in which the recipients, us, view this as matter of fact, as self-evident, as logical and commonsensical, okay? So in other words, hegemony implies that we don't see ourselves as oppressed. We see ourselves living and working within a system that we have grown to accept. We just see it as self-evident, as obvious, as like, well, duh. That's just how things are. Now, this adds an interesting normative and subjective element to something that I have otherwise been providing rather structural arguments in favor of, right? Both Dahl and Linz and Stepan provide structural and institutional criteria for what a democracy is and what a consolidated democracy looks like. Dahl provides the real skeletal foundations, the cement foundations, the steel framework. Linz and Stepan do some of the critically important interior decorating. But it is Tocqueville that cites the normative attitudes that go into this discussion of how hegemonic a democratic framework can be. And, it was after I had that session with the student. I wish I knew what the student's name was. I failed to, I wish I remembered his name. But it's after the student had asked this question about democracy, a democratic hegemony, that I started leafing through Tocqueville, because what Tocqueville is good at is pointing out the attitudes among Americans, at least in the early 19th century, how they collectively think and how institutions have shaped their ideas and their values to the point where the public becomes the biggest defenders of the institutions, right? There's no need for a security apparatus. There's no need for a thought police. The public is its own thought police. And the United States, for instance, has been replete over the decades, centuries, with political thinkers that we today might regard as, intellectuals, sages, whatever, but in their own time were derided as, dangerous deviants, as radicals who, thought outside the box, but whose thoughts and ideas, threatened the foundations of stability. Right. So, today we talk about, how, slavery, thank God, has been abolished for more than a century, whereas people who were preaching abolition throughout much of the early to mid 19th century were seen as rabble-rousers, not even in just the South, but even in the North. People talking about civil rights, or people advocating for the legalization of marijuana, people talking about greater women's rights, abortion rights, gay rights. Today many of these things, especially among younger Americans, is seen as self-evident. Right, the argument has been effectively won. But it wasn't really that long ago. I mean, I can tell you that as far as marijuana legalization, 20 years ago, that was still considered to be somewhat risque, right? That was considered to be somewhat unconventional because of the stigma that marijuana had been associated with, pretty much up there with heroin and cocaine and crack and everything else like that, right? I'm mentioning this now, a few months into New Jersey legalizing the production and the possession and the selling of marijuana, and I can tell you that I happily voted yes on that prop because I think, even though I don't partake in God's magical little plant, I see the economic value for it, and I see the idiocy for incarcerating people who possess, a plant that we consider to be somewhat, stigmatic. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that there is a downside to consolidated democracies, in the sense that structurally, a democracy can work and function quite well, but we haven't really talked about what the people think within that system. We haven't really talked about what values define that democracy, because democracies can still function within high degrees of xenophobia, racism, intolerance, exclusive communitarianism. And if you happen to meet the criteria for a privileged group of people, well, then life is great for you. But if you're on the outskirts, if you're a minority, a religious, a racial, an ethnic, a linguistic, a sexual minority, right, you're considered an outsider. And the public will safeguard its rules, its hegemonic rules, to prevent you from being a fully participating citizen within that system. And it may take years, if not decades, for collective mindset to change. And sometimes it's not whether or not someone has a better argument. It's that sometimes you just have to wait for the prevailing voting generation to just simply die and be replaced by younger people who think differently. So Tocqueville, among a number of things that he writes about the United States at the time, noted the potential tyranny of the majority, in the idea that, if you think about a democracy and its electoral procedures, it is the idea with the most votes, the candidate with the most votes, right, wins, right? That's it. It's pretty simple. And the other problem with the electoral fallacy is that if there is a noted majority segment of the community that will always win on something, what does that say about the minority? Now, we might be tempted to think that the minority is just simply unpopular, doesn't have the best ideas, and just needs to change its rhetoric around. And this is unfortunately what happens in a lot of structural democracies, is that, hey, if you want to win elections, if you want to get this or you got to get that, you may have to change around your viewpoints. And sometimes your viewpoints, your actual viewpoints, are far more beneficial for society than conforming to the norm, right? So if you're one of those people, let's say in the 1980s, that are talking about the need for union empowerment and working class solidarity in an age of neoliberal capitalism brought on by Ronald Reagan, you're kind of laughed out of the room as some old socialist, some worse, even a communist that hates America in that sense. Just kind of go onto YouTube and see if you can find some old Bernie Sanders public access TV interviews where he's talking about really the same things today as he was in the 80s. And, in some cases, when they have people calling in, they got viewers that are accusing him of being a communist. And at some point, he even said, and this was rather provocative at the time, it's like, well, what's the matter with communism? When you think of communism, you think of the Soviet Union. I don't. I think of, activism. I think of social democracy. It didn't win him any friends. But it's kind of interesting how Bernie Sanders only becomes a public phenomenon over the past couple of years because his viewpoints resonate with a younger generation of Americans who don't necessarily have the ability to benefit from the American dream as their parents and grandparents did. So, this final set of things is that if democracy is also a state of mind, there does run the risk that collective consciousness can be outdated and can be very undemocratic. Even during the segregationist period of the South, okay, we're talking George Wallace, Biloxi, Mississippi, all of that stuff, when, whites only, Negroes in the back, or whatever it is, right? If you were to get into a time machine and go back to that period, right, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, of the 50s and 60s, okay, and you were to see full-blown apartheid in the United States, if you were to go up to any of these, white working class people and ask them, is this a democracy? They'd look you right in the face and they would say, absolutely. This is a total democracy. This is a reflection of what we want. We don't want them, and them is a broad stroke group of people that range from African Americans to Catholics to gays to communists. We don't want them, the not us, getting into our community and ruining things, right? We elect people who promise to keep things as traditional and as orderly as possible. And that right there is the rule of the majority, right? And if whoever, the African Americans, whoever don't want it, they can go someplace else. I mean, technically speaking, right, segregationist South was procedurally and functionally democratic. And people who were talking about the need for greater empowerment of blacks, the greater independence and autonomy for women, the separation of church and state, they may have had, theoretically, right, the best ideas in mind for a more progressive social democratic community, but they were laughed out, if not chased out, of their community once they made that speech. And so the idea is that, in a democracy, we don't punish dissension in the same way that authoritarian states do, right? Authoritarian states will take the dissenters and, either public censorship, incarceration, or worse, death in that sense, right? Democracies don't do that for a number of reasons. One, democracies want to constantly show that they're above this type of authoritarian punishment. Incarceration just kind of makes someone a lightning rod. Execution for just simply saying a different idea, turns them into a martyr. Okay, so what do democracies do? Democracies actually have an built-in fail-safe that's probably even more destructive than the worst forms of punishment of authoritarian states, and that is we turn the dissenter into a delegitimized nobody. We make your viewpoint irrelevant. And it doesn't matter whether your viewpoint is absolutely crazy conspiracy theory or speaks to the heart of progressive social democratic values. If the community does not want you and your viewpoints to change the way that things are, we will make you irrelevant. And so here I point to page 298 in your Tocqueville reading. And this talks about how the majority in the United States is all-powerful and oftentimes can impede progress. So if you want to just pause the video for a minute and bring out your Tocqueville or bring it up on PDF here, I point to the bottom part, right? The bottom part of 298 here, and I'm going to read. This is really important stuff here. Formerly, tyranny employed chains and executioners as its crude weapons. But nowadays, civilization has civilized despotism itself, even though it appeared to have nothing else to learn. Princes had, so to speak, turned violence into a physical thing, but our democratic republics have made it into something as intellectual as the human will it intends to restrict. Under the absolute government of one man, despotism, in order to attack the spirit, crudely struck the body, and the spirit escaped free of its blows, rising gloriously above it. But in democratic republics, tyranny does not behave in that manner. It leaves the body alone and goes straight to the spirit. No longer does the master say, "You will think as I do, or you will die." He says, "You're free not to think like me. Your life, property, everything will be untouched. But from today, you are a pariah among us. You will retain your civic privileges, but they will be useless to you. For if you seek the votes of your fellow citizens, they will not grant you them. And if you simply seek their esteem, they will pretend to refuse you that too. You will retain your place among men, but you will lose the rights of mankind. When you approach your fellows, they will shun you like an impure creature, and those who believe in your innocence will be the very people to abandon you lest they be shunned in their turn. Go in peace. I grant you your life, but it is a life worse than death." Now that's pretty hardcore. But in a way, you answer that question of, is democracy hegemonic? And if your answer is yes, you also have to think about if hegemony is a frame of mind, thinking outside that mindset, right, risks you being shunned. And again, we don't throw you in jail. We don't incarcerate you. We don't kill you. We turn you into a ridiculous nobody, right? You can go on the speaking circuit. Nobody takes you seriously. If you're lucky, you might get a spot on Dancing with the Stars in a couple of years, okay? And, prior to Bernie Sanders, right, we had people like Dennis Kucinich, Al Gore, even to a degree. He was widely mocked for his then alarm bells for the environment. These are just two people I can think. Ron Paul. I used to be a big fan of Ron Paul. Now, the man is just becoming unhinged. But I remember when Ron Paul was running for president back in, I think it could have been 2000 or 2008. I don't necessarily remember. But Ron Paul did say one thing that I absolutely agreed with in terms of his assessment of American foreign policy. And that was, American foreign policy is doing two things at the same time, simultaneously, in perpetuity. The first is it's trying to put out the fires that it created 20 years ago. And it is laying the embers of what will eventually explode in another 20 years. So, Paul was very much against the idea of American interventionism. Whatever his beliefs were about, Arab Muslim culture, his idea was regime change has been detrimental and it has only created problems for us. This garnered him widespread condemnation across the Republican Party, who called him un-American, an American hater, someone who doesn't believe in democracy. And I'm thinking, no, the guy is absolutely correct. The guy is absolutely correct about foreign policy. He said our intervention in Iran in 1979 was what caused the revolution to happen, was what put the Ayatollah, in power, because of our support for the Shah, our support for rudimentary, Mujahideen forces in Afghanistan against the Soviets in the 1980s, sowed the seeds for al-Qaeda. Our support for Saddam Hussein in the 1980s against Iran gave him the chemical weapons that were needed to gas the Kurds. And of course, this, being mentioned in a public forum, he's widely denounced as being un-American. And the thing is, he's absolutely correct about this. When Bernie Sanders talks about how, Castro had improved the rate of literacy in Cuba from the Batista regime, right? He's widely, condemned for being pro-Castro, pro-communist. He loves genocide, blah, 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 right? So it's amazing how when you speak outside of the normal framework, right, you run the risk of being stigmatized. Now, with someone like Sanders, he can now rely on social media and alternative forms of information. The internet has kind of prevented him from being turned into a pariah. But the point to be made here, again, is that, when democracy is the only game in town, one of the worst things about democracies is that when they consolidate, the ideologies consolidate. And it becomes very difficult to introduce new ways of thinking and new forms of development as civilization, economics, and mindsets, also develop. So we've covered a lot here, right? I mean, I'm pretty certain that you didn't expect us to spend this amount of time describing and explaining democracy, right? You thought that it was just simply one simple definition, and that's all that we need. Obviously, I'm a fan of, democracies that work. I'm a fan of maximum strength democracies. I'm not interested in the minimum requirements because, those are, they're a dime a dozen here. So, by way of a conclusion and by way of, I guess, wrapping up, what's democracy's balance sheet? We've come away with 2 lectures here talking about democracy having a number of, critical things to look for. Probably the most structural and the most foundational, right, was provided by Dahl. Democracies are ones that have high degrees of political contestation, as well as significant degrees of public participation. And the chart that he provides, right, closed hegemonies, competitive oligarchies, inclusive hegemonies, and polyarchies. It is a living, breathing, organic chart in which most of the countries today can fit somewhere along the way. The United States certainly is not up there at the top with polyarchies, but it's definitely much more, center to center right, center, top right than, let's say, more closed hegemonies are. And I'd be actually interested to see where you would place that. But obviously, the structural foundations require some interconnecting network of features, chief of which are a congruent set of civil and political societies, an established constitutional rule of law, a functioning state bureaucracy, and finally, a regulated market economy. Right? And these are the things that were provided to us by Juan Linz and Alfred Stepan. And the understanding that a democracy is consolidated when the concept of democracy, the idea of democracy, is the only game in town. I love this euphemistic statement here because it really gets the point across. Leads us to conclude that democracy has to be a hegemonic idea. And that in of itself is one way of explaining why, citizens of democracies just don't consider all, authoritarian alternatives all the time. The problem that we need to realize, though, is that with the idea of democracy being hegemonically consolidated, it does come with some concerns, right? Concerns for entrenched ideas that limit thinking and constrain new ideas. So, democracies can be rather reactionary. They can be stifling. They can be somewhat outdated. I know that we're not using the United States as a primary case study for this class, but, it's front and center right now where new progressive ideas, universal health care, increased minimum wage, empowered unions, Green New Deal, elements like this, right? They're met with wide-scale public approval, but they will often die in congressional committee. And, before it even reaches the Republicans to vote down, we're constantly gaslighted by centrist Democrats by saying, well, that'll never work, that'll never pass, that's pie in the sky ideas. And the public, half the public goes home and says, well, I guess that's the end of it. And the other half of the public is like, well, wait a minute, you people work for us. If this is what we want, this is what you vote on. Who are you to tell us that this is not how it has to be? Who are you beholden to? So as you can see, right, democracies are, well, they're not end products, right? Is the one thing that I'll end this lecture on is that there's this temptation to think that when a country becomes democratically consolidated, it's just time to, kick back, light up, and, enjoy the rest of your life. And that's not true at all. Democracies constantly need to be tinkered with. They need to be adhered to. They're like plants. They're like pets. They need to be watered. They need to be fed. They need to be taken care of. Otherwise, the plant will wither, and the pet will, look for alternative forms of food if you don't feed it. Well, the same thing is with a democracy, is that, once we reach that consolidated stage, it's not, okay, we're in New York Penn Station, everybody get out. But we have to constantly safeguard it. We have to make certain that changing values are reflected within and among our elected officials. Because if there is this obstacle, there will be a possible risk of a public backlash, which, in the most innocuous sense, is just simply voting out the incumbents for, new alternatives. But if that doesn't even seem to work, then yes, more unconventional political organizations and a rise in political extremism can certainly manifest. Now, I might be getting a little ahead of myself here because I don't want to be spoiling the fun for the second half of class. But at the risk of giving away some of the plot, democracies can die. Democracies can collapse. It's not like once you're a democracy, everything is great. Again, these things need to be safeguarded. And that, I think, is a great way for us to move into the next 3 weeks as we examine 3 case studies of consolidated democracies: the United Kingdom, Germany, and India. All 3 being built on different historical circumstances, and all 3 today functioning with different challenges, different obstacles, and different paths for future trajectory. All right, so that really ends our theoretical discussion of what democracies are, how they function, and what we can expect. The next 3 weeks are going to be case study after case study. You are now responsible for these very long chapters within your textbook, but lectures that accompany it will help flesh out the real important stuff. And by this point, I really hope to, get your input, your thoughts, your comments, both in online discussion as well as our Zoom meetings. So enjoy the rest of the day. Happy reading, and I will see you online real soon. Take care, everyone.